Good afternoon, and thank you for coming today. Chris, Marquette, thank you for putting this on. My name is John Miller. I'm with Dana Investment Advisors, proud sponsor here, and glad to have a panel of asset owners, folks that we've been helping within the space in ESG for over 20 years. Also, you saw Chris's great video that he introduced earlier today. I'm one of the participants on the executive education course, along with one of the panelists here, who I guess will now be sort of a colleague of mine, which is great. Real quick, I'll just introduce everybody. Joining us virtually, I don't know if he's coming up here. We'll wait until he's here. There he is. So this is Karl Slobacki. He is the president of Northland College. I hope I got that last name correct. I also have on the far right Sean Gissel. He is the CIO of the endowment here at Marquette University. Next to Sean is Dan Ramito. Dan is a partner and director of ESG strategy and implementation at Pickering Energy Partners. And then next to Dan is a good friend and individual I've known for a while now, Christopher Cox, who is the Associate Director of 7th Generation Interfaith Coalition for Responsible Investing. Breathe. The panel moderator here is Dr. Peck, and Associate Director of Finance here at Marquette. So, thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Marquette. I also have the dubious distinction of having been Chris Merker's dissertation chair. So I can confirm what Matteo said. He is the original Energizer Bunny. And one thing that we want to start off talking about in this session is the use of data by issuers. So we're thinking about these are all, not issuers, investors. These are all asset owners and using data to come up with an ESG strategy. I've done work in corporate governance and now moving into the ESG space, and I can tell you, as Jeffrey Hale was talking about the SASB standards, the first thing I wanted to know was, when are these going to be items on CompuStat? So I have to make a little plug for academia here, which is that we will also be evaluating the state and doing large-scale empirical studies to validate it. But the first thing I want to ask the panel to discuss is the use of data that they use for the ESG strategies. And if I think about the way evaluating issuers on ESG metrics has gone, we sort of started out with KLD, and Peter Kinder, and Socrates, and they were sort of hiring philosophy majors from Bowdoin College who were doing kind of this messy kind of liberal arts type approach to coming up with reports for companies using a vast array of public data sources like OSHA reports. Then the next generation, we get to companies like Sustainalytics, and they're designing questionnaires for issuers. And so now we get to this issue where the issuers are saying this is a real pain in the neck to fill out. And on top of which, I get different ratings. I might get an A from one rating agency and a D from another. And so investors or asset owners are thinking, oh, what do I do? And now we're sort of evolving into a different arena, and I want to know, at least at this moment, what types of data that you guys are using to implement your strategies, and if you can kind of speak to that. Anybody want to go first?
I'll start it out.
Go ahead, Dan.
Are these on? Oh,
go.
Sorry. So I think a lot of the panels earlier did a great job of highlighting some of the deficiencies in data, and why I bring that up first is because, unfortunately, you have to very much, in my opinion, understand where the deficiencies lie to kind of pinpoint what you want to use. And just so I don't upset, how many people are here from MSCI or Sustainalytics? Okay, are we going to do like Chatham House rules here, I hope? Whoever said it, and I can't remember who it was, but they made a great point that it's not data, it's opinion. The correlations between MSCI, Sustainalytics, and ISS, while they're in some cases insightful perspectives, is not data. Those are opinions. And MSCI in particular suffers from three key biases, which I think plagues the ESG world. It's time, size, and herding. On the time perspective, it's a retrospective. So as an investor, you very much obviously want to understand how things are coming along or how things will move along in the future. In the case of some of the providers, and we don't have to pick on any of them, they're still providing you like 2018, 2019 data. It's thank you, but no thanks. On the size component, one of the major issues is there's a lot of pandering to their client base, which is fine. You know, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard utilize the providers across the board to fuel ETFs. And in most cases, the average size, the average market cap of the provider data is 8 billion. So for a private equity investor like myself, or even on the public side, we have a public set of mutual funds, it's really hard to get standardized data for the small and the mid-cap world. And then on the herding perspective, I don't want to belabor this anymore, where I really get frustrated is I think the data providers play their favorites, right? The S&P is what, 35% technology, and oil and gas is the big evil culprit in the room. Energy transition does not happen without the oil and gas community. We were talking about this before. There's no way on God's green planet that happens without oil and gas. And unfortunately, that is the place that needs data and understanding the most. So we can't rely on them because they've taken a very partial and very biased view on the data, in my opinion. And so what we've done is put in place questionnaires. We're one of those people where like, can you please figure out this questionnaire? But our questionnaire is like maybe 20 questions, and we literally go side by side. And I'm actually not necessarily that big of a fan of standardization. I do think SASB plays an incredibly important role in the capital markets. But if standardization, at least in private equity, comes into play, my fear is it's going to make my job harder to understand who's doing a really, really good job and who's just copying what their peers are doing.
Maybe I'll jump in. So I work with 36 institutional investors, faith-based mostly and some values-based. So you think about like the Jesuits who helped found Marquette. I work with them and in engaging their portfolio. And so as a nonprofit, small budget, we don't pay for the data. We work with a lot of other NGOs that provide assessments, and we use those. So among them, one of the ones I think is really important is CPA Zicklin, Center for Political Accountability, with Wharton, puts together an assessment of political spending disclosures by companies. World Benchmarking Alliance has the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, which is very good in terms of assessing due diligence, and I think that's a really critical report that they give each year. They have a new report coming out on the just transition. It's going to debut next month at COP26, and it'll assess 180 companies. It'll be toward those big ones, but again, it's important data to be able to kind of attempt to measure apples to apples. CA 100 benchmark is valuable. They're adding a just transition indicator in March of 2022. They also have auditing and financial integration of climate risk disclosures. Again, there are opinions in those kinds of assessments, but we've got to find some tools that are being honed and refined over time. CDP is valuable. In some of the other work we do, access to nutrition index is valuable. Access to medicine index is valuable to us. One tool that's out there that I think is really great is the U.S. State Department's TIP report, Trafficking in Persons report. It's been out 20 years now, and if you look at a conflict mineral disclosure from a company and then compare that to the Tier 2 watch list or Tier 3 companies or countries, which are the worst, you'll find that that's where a lot of it's coming from. If you look at our clothing, and the labels on those, most of our clothing is coming from Tier 2 watch list or Tier 3 countries. And that says that those companies that are producing in their supply chain, those kinds of things, have some significant issues to be looking at. As You Sow puts out the most overpaid CEOs list every year. I think that's a valuable thing to look at. Managing Digital Rights Index is another good one to look at, I think. But those are all ones that are free, and they put the information out there of how they gather it.
I would say from Marquette's perspective, we're at a higher level. We're not actually asset managers, and so we're really relying on our individual investment managers. And for Marquette, in most cases, we're looking for higher level acknowledgments, signatories of the PRI, voting proxy statements consistent with ICCR. So trying to follow at a much higher level with the way that we're looking at the data. Now we synthesize the data from our managers, most of it's proprietary, the way they form opinions for what's socially responsible. And so we try to validate that to each extent for each manager.
I'm just going to add that we divested from fossil fuels, and then we went to a manager to ensure that that would happen. So our manager is actually taking care of the integrity of our assets. And I would say that one of the issues that came up is that we have graduates of the institution who are employed in the fossil fuel industries, and they were quite vexed as we did this divestment, which was a student initiative. And so there are, again, multiple sides to this, and we should be tracking our data better, but as it is, we are listening to our managers.
Now, with corporate reporting, of course, we heard a lot about the SASB standards. Do you see any issues where corporation would start to game the system? In other words, they realize that if they respond in a certain way to question X, they're going to get the rating up, and it may belie a little bit of their underlying activities. Anybody who wants to jump in?
Yeah,
first?
I guess
Dan?
just in the interest of going in circles,
Yeah.
just rotation. And once again, I give credit. I think it was the gentleman from Nuveen on the earlier last panel. I totally, I wanted to stand up. I am against SEC. Here, I'll back up. I don't think the SEC should get involved too much with ESG reporting. And it's not a political statement at all. Actually, it's the opposite. I think it was Dean. Once the SEC gets involved, then it becomes political. And this is the pursuit of data. This is the pursuit of understanding. Once you put a sandbox around these companies, it's going to be a little bit of game theory that's going on here. They're going to just copy what their peers are doing. They're going to do the bare minimum in most cases, and it's unfortunately going to make my job a little bit harder. I think it's one of those things, like if you go to a management team and you have a conversation and you say, well, what do you think of this regulation? There's usually an eye roll, there's usually a sigh. If you say, well, this is what your peers are doing, there's rabbit ears, and they're all of a sudden like, what do you mean? What are you talking about? And so I don't think there's a more influential influence than competitive forces, and no one necessarily wants to be first, and certainly no one wants to be third. But there will eventually be a company who will do it because of investor pressure, which once again is not a regulatory component. So I am hoping that the SEC is just very mindful of to what extent they want to get involved, because you see this with Europe. In Europe, I don't think everyone is just overburdened, in my opinion, and there's just too much going on. And if the point is to figure out what the competitive differentiators of a company are that are viable and that are tangible and that you can figure out how long they're going to stay, I think companies are going to understand how the competitive landscape is going to evolve, and without any sort of essence or any sort of pressure from regulatory bodies, they're going to try to be the most competitive. They're going to try to stand out the most.
I think it's a really great question in terms of the connection between words and actions. Thinking about to take an example of the Jesuits, there's a smaller extractive company they engage that has global operations and have worked closely with that company for several years to help develop a human rights policy. That has been adopted by the board, and because they were smaller, they were behind the curve, if you will, on some of what would be expected of larger companies. But the implementation over time is going to be a critical issue there. There's another company that we've worked with on a number of issues and had a recent conversation with them about human rights policy there. And we laid out for them the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the kinds of basic components we would expect to see in a human rights policy on that. And the new policy they've just put forth follows the notes of our conversation very closely. Now the question becomes, how are they going to do on the implementation of that and the ongoing dialogue and engagement with that company? So I think that, essential to it is robust reporting, ensure that their ESG disclosures are on topics that are material and salient, but more, do they acknowledge errors in those reports? Are they telling us where, we got it wrong here? And if they can admit something like that, I think that's a significant kind of element in terms of what they're going forward. We set this goal, we fell short, and here's what we're doing about it. Do they reward suppliers for revealing problems? That for a lot of traditional supplier engagement, you ask the company to fill out the questionnaire or to sign your code of conduct, tell us if you'll do everything okay. Having told us that, we will give you a check, and we can be comfortable that everything is going all right. But don't tell us about any of your problems. Otherwise, we'll have to send people, and we may not do business with you in the future. And ultimately, we know that that's not a very productive way of doing due diligence, be it either on the environmental side or on the human rights side. I think another important clue is their engagement with stakeholders. You know, as an organization with a lot of Catholic religious orders that are global, we have a presence, I like to think, near the poorest of the poor, the most vulnerable. Part of our mission, we understand, to be, through the lens of faith, to be guiding corporate and investor actions around environment and social justice efforts. And so, you know, that engagement with stakeholders, have they done a human rights impact assessment? Is there an awareness that a code of conduct is not equal with respect for human rights? Is there peer collaboration? I like to point to the example of Colgate. Toothpaste tubes are typically, historically, not recyclable, but Colgate has now developed an intellectual property around a recyclable tube, but it's not going to be at scale until everybody adopts it, so they're sharing their intellectual property with everybody else in the toothpaste industry. And as a lifelong Crest user, I'm suddenly thinking maybe it makes sense for me to reward a company with a little that's doing the right thing. Another thing is about their alignment and misalignment of lobbying. You know, that are they reporting, for instance, these are the activities we've lobbied on. These are our trade associations that may be active on these other things that are misaligned with what we're doing. So there were resolutions around lobbying with ExxonMobil this past year around traditional lobbying disclosure, but also the climate lobbying, and to show those misalignments. If a company can be more forthcoming about those kinds of things, it's going to be better for the company, better for business, better for profits at the end of the day. I think that controversies are also a really important thing. You can have great ESG reports, but if those kinds of things are showing up in the news as controversial topics, it might show a disconnect between what the company's saying and what they're doing. And I know that while you're not wild about Scope 3 kinds of...
I'm absolutely not wild about Scope 3.
I would say, though, that the Scope 3 ambitions of companies like Walmart, Microsoft, Nestle, they've set forth challenging Scope 3 targets, and that means everybody in their supply chain has to change. And that's really important to me in terms of kind of trying to work to build a better planet for my son. Maybe I'll close that part out there for a moment and see if somebody else has to add.
John?
I have nothing to add after those two.
Karl, do you have anything?
Yeah, I have two things to add. One is pertinent to Northland, and then the other is pertinent to another responsibility that I have. I understood your question to be, can you game the system? Without gaming the system, let me talk about how to game the system. We are beholden to the Association for the Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Education, which runs a rating system around sustainability. And what we have done is that we've divested in order to raise our score. I'm not sure that the full implications of that divestment, as I indicated in my previous answer, have been understood or carried out in terms of the unintended consequences or whatever. But this is a prime example in my game of what you can do in order to get a better rating. And we're dependent upon that as an institution that's in the environmental sector. So that's one answer. The other one is that I also am the vice chair of a multi-employer plan for retirement with the Wisconsin Association of Independent Colleges and Universities. And that is basically a $375 million plan. It has become incumbent upon us, in order to keep our customers and to grow our customer base, our member base, that we add in SRIs and that we build basically a portfolio of SRIs. So there again, we are, if you will, gaming the system by bringing in these new asset classes. So I'll stop there.
What are you, Carl, just to follow up, what are you using to decide what goes into your investments or not? What data do you use?
That's a very good question. Right now, once again, we are dependent upon our manager of managers and the data that
Okay.
they have provided to us. Whether that has integrity or not, I can't say.
You sure? And here's another question that you've already kind of touched up on. You know, you mentioned we can kind of think about traditionally the way that SRI would be implemented is you'd have shareholder engagement or divestment. So obviously you touched on divestment, but what role does shareholder, I extend this question to the whole panel, what role does shareholder engagement play in your ESG strategy? Dan?
In respectful terms, with all due respect, I don't see the advantage of divestment from is fossil fuels in a special, right? That just extenuates the problem. For example, we have a variety of companies, mostly by the majors, that have a portfolio of dirty assets that they will sell that is purchased by the private equity side. Now, some of those majors can say, look, we're getting cleaner, okay? But that asset still remains in place. And it's just being transferred to the private side, which has the luxury of not being as transparent, just because they don't have to. So what is the central issue you're trying to accomplish here? Is it you just want the perception of being cleaner? Fine, sell some dirty assets, put them over to the private side, make some money, and there you go. Or is it, do we really want to tackle this problem? Divestment just extenuates the problem, in my opinion. Collaboration, or is what we traditionally maybe called activism, say is working with that company to figure out how to address the problem point on, right? Because it's it's between a rock and a hard place. If a major, for example, or any company is going to have any sort of controversy, their cost of capital is going to increase, they're probably going to take a hit in the stock price. No one wants that. I asked the question earlier, which was a little bit leading the witness, but I'm not necessarily a big fan of quarterly reporting. I think oil and gas in particular, but across most smaller companies, those respective investors need much more of a biotech investor mentality than anything else, right? For a small company reporting quarterly earnings, that's frankly stupid. It's like when you finish earnings, you're just preparing for the next earnings. You're not necessarily thinking about anything strategic. So in the purpose of addressing the problem, I don't necessarily feel that divestment is the right answer, because I think a greater component of solutions can be held when you are collaborating with that particular corporate to achieve what you set out to achieve in the first place.
Yeah, I would just say that since short-termism came up in this thing, we actually did a study for the CFA where we looked at that. And in fact, if companies were focused on beating earnings, they actually invested less in terms of capital expenditures and so forth. Mm-hmm. And if that's the case, that a lot of that capital expenditure is going into reinvestment into green energy, then you're getting hurt by that.
You're going to get crucified if you're doing that in the public market, right? And Nuveen, I think, said it perfectly. Like oil and gas have and I'm being oil and gas partial here, I get it, but it's the quintessential example. They don't talk about renewables because they will get crucified for talking about renewables, but everyone wants them to do renewables, right? It's this circular pattern of death where if you talk too much about renewables, you're going to take a hit in the stock price, which is going to constrict access to capital, which is the capital that you need anyway to invest in the renewables. So until the capital markets ease up on quarterly reporting, and until we give a little bit more leeway on data reporting or bare minimum standards, this problem is probably going to perpetuate itself.
I would say I'm similar to Dan in regards to an emphasis on engagement. And I think if I go back to my time here at Marquette in 2010, we co-filed with Creighton for a human rights policy that took us a few years before it reached approved outcome, which I view as our first real foray into the engagement with managers or wanting to achieve a desired outcome. And so I won't be as harsh as Dan in the spirit that I view divestment more as a last resort as compared to a first resort. And so as part of the process at Marquette, for example, in the last 5 years, we've had less than 20% of our managers were signatories of the PRI, which is a UN initiative for 6 founding principles for engagement and considering the risks of climate change and other ESG factors with their investment decision. And along with that, for them is some kind of engagement in monitoring the progress that they're making. And when I look at 5 years ago to today, we're over 60% of our managers are now signatories of the PRI. So I think I've taken the mindset with some of the discussions that I have, because it can be contentious, is don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. And so we're slowly making this transition of trying to do the right thing and also being mindful of the opportunity set that we're operating in. And if I would belabor on one more point to make in regards to gaming the system, what I see today is a lot of headlines and quips to what people want to have, a Yahoo headline or a tweet or a Twitter stuff, whatever that is. And a lot of schools claim divestment. And when you dig into those, it's a little bit more hairy. Oftentimes it's divestment from direct holdings and separately managed, and exceptions for commingled funds, or not being done for the next 5, 10, 20 years. And so I've urged people along the way is just to be mindful of what divestment means and how it's being defined depending on the institution.
I would actually agree with my colleagues on at the conference that there needs to be a way to do this with a great deal more integrity than it has been done. Again, understand, I'm not going to defend this, but this was a decision that was made before my administration. But I am not sure that we have reached the level of satisfaction that we should have around this decision. And I'm actually turning to all of you to help us figure out what would be the best way to track this going forward.
Yeah, Chris, you look
Yeah,
like
I think that for us, I mean, our purpose is around shareholder engagement with companies. I mean, our founder, Father Mike Crosby, started our organization in 1973. We were one of the early parts of the ICCR, which is 50 years old this year, and engaged around GM, that resolution to apartheid South Africa. Father Mike was very involved around the campaigns around Nestle and its infant formula marketed to Africa. He was a thorn in the flesh for the tobacco industry for many years and in many ways. And part of it is the notion that you've got to have a seat at the table if you want to talk to them. And so there are a number of companies that we engage with and we're in dialogue with that personally, ethically, I've got some significant ethical qualms about their line of business. But talking with them, Pope Francis would talk about a theology of encounter, that going with an open mind and open heart and trying to talk about at least places that we can find some common agreement and make some steps forward that are good for people and for planet. And so that maybe it's a private prison company that you're talking with and trying to work with them around improving human rights for those that are in their care. Maybe it's a tobacco company and trying to make sure that their products, which are going to kill half of their customers, aren't being directed toward kids, or finding ways of trying to reduce that harm. Maybe it's questioning a tobacco company that says they're moving into health and sponsoring, like last week,
I know exactly what health
a Wall Street Journal forum on the future of health. Yeah. That we feel part of our role is to kind of cut through some of the noise and ask tough questions. Shareholder meeting a few years ago at JP Morgan Chase, Jamie Dimon is really good about taking questions from shareholders. Sister Pat Daly of the Caldwell Dominican said, "You've got a great human rights policy on your website. How do you share that? How do you square that with your investment in private prisons?" And the ongoing conversation around a couple of letters to get him to finally talk to us, because he promised he'd give an answer, led to them making some particular decisions about that and moving out of their investments in that, except for those commingled funds and the other kinds of things where they were kind of otherwise restricted. But that, there's a strategy. You start with trying to have a conversation. Maybe it's a letter. And if they don't respond to it, then maybe it's filing a resolution and trying to get proxies to vote in favor of that resolution to try and amp up the pressure. If they don't respond over time, then you work on vote no campaigns for some of the board members. That they're ultimately, if they're unresponsive, if they're intransigent, then divestment may be what's required at the end of the day for that particular company. And it's a tension being felt within Catholic circles. Pope Francis in 2015 put out Laudato Si, an encyclical letter, and there's now the Laudato Si platform, which is calling for Catholic entities to withdraw from investments in the fossil fuel industry. Some of our members are moving forward with that, and others aren't. And so even inside of our organization, there's some tension around that. But we think that being at the table and being in conversation is critical.
It's a great example. I mean, we engaged a couple companies on the public side. So Pickering, we do have a research arm. They're the former Hikeden group. We purchased them at the beginning of the year. So David Hikeden is a pretty well-known energy, oil and gas enthusiast. But there are a couple things when we looked at the data, there's a couple things that actually stuck out. So we took BP's statistical data set, and what we saw was, and this is kind of straight out of the no-duh files, was global populations are expanding, developing countries in order to take the next step in order to, let's just call it economic prosperity. One of the first tenets that they have is affordable energy. They have to eliminate energy poverty in order to attain a certain economic status. Now, that energy usually comes in oil and gas because natural gas and some of the more renewables are just far too expensive for a developing country to go or to pursue. And if you look at the efficiency, just purely statistical, the United States next to Canada and Norway are the most efficient and cleanest producers of oil and gas. Now for us, it's, well, who are the cleanest of the clean, right? We want that data. So we start with very high level, and then we're looking more towards progression. So I know there's a lot of comments on targets and science-based targets, and I'm not necessarily against that, but to make investment decisions as it relates to us is I'd much rather see 5-year trend of what emissions have been doing and what it's forecast to do over the next 5 years, take that within the macro, and then not even pay any attention, frankly, to the MSCI or the Sustainalytics or the ISS of the world, and then make our decisions based off that. The frustrating thing about MSCI in particular, and like I don't have any, ex-girlfriend or whatever that works at MSCI or anything like that. I'm just, they just have cornered the data market. 50% of the ESG weighting for a Chevron is the E, right? 10% of the E, or 10% of the weighting for the E for Amazon is, or 10% of the weighting is for the E for Amazon. Who has a larger scope 1 and scope 2 footprint between Chevron and Amazon? It's Amazon, right? But if you just go by the high level data, Amazon only has 10% of the weighting for that, and Chevron has 50%.
Sarah, I'd just like to
Yeah.
clarify a few comments.
Sure.
So in regards to Pope Francis and the moral imperative that he spoke about, something we followed, and we've even played the TED Talk video at an investment committee to make sure that everybody's familiar. And as much as it's been highlighted, the way Pope Francis spoke about it, he did say excluding investments from companies that don't meet the parameters of integral ecology. But it also says while rewarding those that work concretely during this transitional phase. And so in May of this year, the Vatican came out with its 7-year plan and 7 guiding principles. And ultimately, that segue talks about the engagement and urging companies to work forward. And so that's really what we're trying to embrace at Marquette, is that aspect of having a plan and moving things forward. With that said, the second point or clarification I want to make is along with engagement, you have to document it. So we keep letters from our managers to companies. So we have a manager that's engaging Nintendo and Electronic Arts for not having a climate change plan. So it funnels down to all aspects, I guess, of the economy and something that you have to monitor and document. And that's really where I think about the transition for Marquette. That's what we're trying to get better at.
Sure. Do you have anything else you want to add, Karl, to the discussion?
Thank you. No.
May I add?
Yeah, go for it.
I think the data is really important, but I also think that it's important to keep in front of us human faces. Washington Post reported that 1 out of 3 Americans experienced extreme climate events this summer. My brother works out west. He's the archivist at Yosemite National Park, and he's been surrounded by fires all summer long. I've got friends in New Orleans, and we know what happened there. And if people in New York faced all kinds of flooding in the subway because of that same hurricane hit when it finally hit up there as a storm. And yet, our impacts here pale in comparison with what so many people in really vulnerable places are experiencing. And so that it is essential for us, we believe, to help bring that voice and that urgency of those impacted communities. That climate adversely affects, especially peoples of color. It affects the poor more than it's going to affect those of us in more privileged locations. Today, October 11th, Columbus Day historically, we're recognizing it now as Indigenous Peoples Day. When we think about like FPIC, free prior informed consent, and the kinds of things around extractives and the obligations we have towards Indigenous peoples. When we think about our obligation both for people and planet and that intimate connection between environmental justice on those two things, and to bring urgency into those conversations with companies.
Well, the last question what we discussed that we would talk about is the complexities involved in divestment. And so, go for it, Dan.
Well, here's another data point, and I was just reading this last week. So we have investment committee tomorrow. Then I had to prepare for this, and I came across a pretty fascinating study on energy transition. Right. So I mean, all across the board. And I can't remember their names, and I had it written down, and I lost it, which was awesome. But what these data scientists did was they looked back to every market adoption, I think since 1850, and the average duration from market introduction to broader commercialization is 32 years. It's 32 years, right? And I was thinking about, God, that's such a long time. But then I think about, my wife had, girls' night, last week, and she's like, oh, like the Uber's coming to get me. I'm like, oh, okay, I didn't think twice about it. Whereas 10 years ago, my wife said, I'm going out with the ladies, and I texted this complete stranger, and he's gonna come to the house, and he's gonna pick me up, and he's gonna drive me there. And then I'm gonna call another stranger when I'm not intoxicated, but probably buzzed, and he's gonna pick me up, and he's gonna take me home. And I would've been like, are you out of your damn mind? Like, that would never happen. But you think about these little things, or like, hey, I'm gonna go online and give my credit card and just have all my bills paid automatically for me. Like today, we don't think about that. 10 years ago, you'd be like, you're insane. 15 years ago, it doesn't happen. So these things take a really long time. And to Sean's point, the documentation of understanding these steps, and I think this goes back a little bit to the comments earlier on kill the queue, and just our obsession. These create like this confirmation bias overhang and this hurting bias overhang to where we really do need a quality of data to battle some of the preconceptions that we as humans just kind of revert back to, right? We have such ADD, such investment ADD, that unless we really take concerted efforts to improve data quality and structure and reporting and standards, we're not going to necessarily execute on the timeline that we want, especially given the fact that it's empirically proven that transitions across the board, across sectors, take 25 to 35 years.
Karl, do you have anything to talk about, about divestment?
Yeah, I just want to basically broaden that discourse and say that the issue that we're facing right now is that sustainability means something very, very different than it meant when we became a small ecological college in 1970. And we're now looking at ways in which we can broaden our understanding of sustainability, climate change, the renewable structures and systems that we need to look at, or resiliency. That word has come up and has begun to infiltrate our world. And so I agree wholeheartedly with my fellow colleagues there that we're really looking at different things now, and we have to develop a different nomenclature and probably metrics around those things as well.
I have we've got a couple more minutes. I just one last comment, again, coming from an academic perspective. How do you see data analytics fitting in here? Because as you talk about how you use ESG strategies, you're really talking about digging in kind of traditional fundamental analysis, as well as with the shareholder engagement piece. So if you wanted to do more broad base, right, not just looking at onesies, but more broad base, have you thought about what role data analytics might play in facilitating us to get better reporting standards? Not the opinions?
No, sorry, I feel like I'm dominating. I hired a woman, she's 25, had no finance experience, but was a Python wizard. I worked at NASDAQ for eight and a half years. I hired her at NASDAQ. And everyone was like, oh, you're committed to diversity. I was like, yeah, totally. I wasn't. She was just amazing. I paid her a 30% premium to follow me because Python and R are so incredibly powerful, and everyone's playing checkers with Excel, and she's playing chess with Python.
Yep. So we've got a few more minutes. Questions from the audience? Any? Yes, please.
Just on the comments around copying peers, touched on greenwashing, washing, social washing. Given if there's suitable criteria for a company to report against, is there value from your lens of having that independent assurance? Would that help at all against companies just copying or ensuring that what they're actually reporting is valuable, is fair?
I would initially say yeah, because it puts both you on the line as well as that company in terms of what they're putting before investors. And that means that what they're reporting, I especially think in terms of like the S, shall we say, that the better the assurances are around actually doing the kind of due diligence that's required of them, I'm all in favor of that. And if getting it audited, then if that advances that, then I'm all right with it, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's got to be the economic considerations of what does an assurance and an audit cost, right? For a smaller company as it relates to, oil and gas, if they're going to audit their scope 3, $2 million revenue is not going to spend $500,000 to audit their scope 3. But generally speaking, I agree, like there's got to be something in place. It just has to make economic sense.
Any other questions?
It's for Karl. I guess I'll preface that I am an ESG investor and I invest in the oil and gas space.
That a boy.
With the thought process that engagement will move us forward, and if you divest of energy, how do you avoid energy in your life today? I mean, are you going to say, I'm going to go live in the woods and build my wooden house and I'm not going to touch energy? Because a lot of the food that came here came on a diesel truck that used energy. So my question to you is, you're not alone. I mean, numerous colleges and universities have divested because of pressure from students. Do you think there will be any pushback from the powers that be to say, students, maybe we should reconsider the position that we've taken if we want to move things forward?
So I could barely hear your question. You were asking about whether we should reconsider our positions, knowing what we know now. I'm not sure that that's a politically smart thing to do. I'm sure we want to continue in our jobs. The upshot of it, though, is that ultimately the decision that we made may not have been as strong as it should have been, and may not have considered all of the implications of what was done. I think that it's important for us to certainly go to our students and say, let's be honest with one another about moving forward, and let's make sure that we're actually looking at the integrity of our investments and ensuring that they are as clean as they could be. How that happens, I'm not sure. I don't know that I have the instruments in hand. Perhaps I can hold my manager or managers responsible for that. But I do
Give me a call.
Yeah,
I'm serious.
But I do believe quite clearly that we need to move to the next level, and probably then to the next level, and then to the next level, and then to the next level.
Yeah, I would just say as far as students go, I went and held a session at Oberlin College, which is the original hippie school. And it really was a process of educating the students because they were all, with pitchforks about what it meant, shareholder engagement being another avenue to get to their end results. So it is a political process, for sure.
But that story should be told with data.
Yeah.
Like, that's the most objective. I mean, I'm being serious. Like, the reason oil and gas got such in trouble is because they were just terrible capital allocators for like 10 years. The shale boom left everyone high and dry, and now they became easy targets.
Yeah.
But the energy transition, along with other things, does not happen, like I said before, without oil and gas. You just can't rely on more of the emotional sentiment to say this is what it is. You have to tell that story quantitatively.
Oh, absolutely. And actually, there was a recent study that came out that said that data is better at persuading people than others. There was a Yale study that they said most people think, African Americans are worse off, but they think it's like the averaging wealth is 10% of whites, but actually it's 90%. So when they provide that data to people, then they're like, oh, didn't know that.
Yep.
So I'm an empirical researcher, so I'm all about the data, just the facts, ma'am, kind of thing.
Well,
Any other questions?
Let me
Yeah.
just, can I piggyback on that last question there? So
Sure.
Sarah, the notion, especially with students and divesting, again, more of a high level thought. In my experience, 16 years at Marquette, typically education, transparency, and even spending time with the students, there tends to be an open mind, which is a positive for me, especially at Marquette. However, one of the biases I think that I've bounced up against the most frequent that I can't tiptoe around is the difference in time horizon. So Dan mentioned that earlier. Students are here for a few short years. I'm managing assets in perpetuity. So again, the way I may think about engagement or divestiture is drastically different the way than a student is, and that's been one of the biggest challenges for myself as far as connecting in regards to that bias.
Yeah, so maybe the short-term time horizon of students, they should get together with the short-term time horizons of CEOs and see if they can meet somewhere.
I have made that suggestion.
Yeah, please. Sure.
You talked a little bit about your advocacy efforts or engagement efforts with I know how Chris does it with his group, and they generally have, ICCR who's got something. Is there unfortunately you're not Harvard or Yale yet with your endowment size, but is there a group that you guys kind of get together that leads, hey, this is what we're going to target this year as an engagement, or how does that conversation work amongst, similar sized endowments?
Yeah, great question. Actually, one of the points that I left out. So we've relied on the Jesuit Conference of Investor Responsibility. So that's where we got the idea, or that's where we got the mission for the human rights policy back 10 years ago, and that's someone that we still follow and try to work with today. So they tend to be our funnel to get down to initiatives that we want to have an impact on. And one of the lessons that I've taken away from Father Wild when I started here is we don't want to take action for a headline. We want to take action for something we can have an influence on. So that's really why the Jesuit Conference has been a good partner for Marquette.
Okay, let's give a nice round for our panelists. Thank you so much, gentlemen.